I am Bob Lingle, and this is the Good Neighbor Podcast. This is a place where I connect with authors and the community. We use this time to discuss life, sometimes death, but always books. I hope you enjoy our conversation today, and I hope you get something out of it. The world is a pretty confusing place right now, so let's do our best to be good neighbors. Hello, everyone. I am Bob Lingle. We're starting off on a bit more of a somber note just because of world events. If you're not from the Lakewood area, we're in Western New York, very close to Buffalo. I am originally from Buffalo, lived and worked there. So what happened this past weekend hits close to home. Before I introduce our great guest, Matthew Cordell, tonight, I want to just talk for a moment. I had talked to a couple of friends. Thank you, Western New York media, for the images that they were capturing, have been capturing throughout the week as the community responds to the awfulness that happened on Saturday. And a lot of the organizations are just so overwhelmed with the amount of support that they've been receiving that I decided to select one specifically. Amanda Woomer runs Spook Eats. She's one of our best-selling authors in the store. She is the author of A Haunted Atlas of Western New York. And her and her husband are collecting donations, financial donations, to then go to the grocery store and buy groceries for people, because unless something has changed, the Tops grocery store in that community is still shut down, and it's the only grocery store within miles of the community. So they need food. They need fresh food, and donating to Spook Eats through Venmo or PayPal, their is at Spook Eats. Whatever money is in excess of what they need for groceries, they're then donating that money to local nonprofit organizations. But if you can help, that would be wonderful. But our guest tonight for our regular programming has illustrated many books for children, including works of poetry, novels, and picture books, including The Only Fish in the Sea and Follow That Frog by Philip Steed. He has written and illustrated numerous picture books, including the one we're talking about tonight, Hello Neighbor, The Kind and Caring World of Mr. Rogers, as well as Bear Island and Wish. His work has been published around the globe in many different languages, including Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Spanish, French, and Italian. Matthew's books have been recognized as Best of the Year selections by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe. And his wordless picture book, Wolf in the Snow, was awarded a 2017 Boston Globe Hornbook Honor Award and the 2018 Caldecott Medal. Matthew lives in suburban Chicago with his wife, author Julie Halpern, and their two children, which we were just discussing before. I'm happy tonight to introduce Matthew Cordell. Thanks for joining us tonight, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Bob. It's great to be here.
We met briefly at the Winter Institute in Baltimore before the world shut down. And
Yeah.
I've talked to a few authors that I met at that event, and it's just so wild to look back on that time, just months before, and that could have been ground zero for the spread of COVID.
Yeah.
And I, since that event, and then the COVID shutdown, our store was shut down for 2.5 months. Um, your book came out in the middle of those 2.5 months, and I was a huge Mr. Rogers fan. I was excited to meet you. I was excited to meet Francois Clemens at that same event, and looking forward to promoting your book. And your marketing team had sent out an open close sign that
Mm-hmm.
became such a part of our closure and then reopening that because I hung it up as soon as I got it, and then I turned it closed on March 21st of 2020, and then 2.5 long months went by before I was able to turn it back
Wow.
open. Um, so I still use that as my open close sign for the store.
Nice.
So thank you for designing that and contributing the artwork for it. But I have felt this odd one way kinship with you. So when Holiday House had reached out about doing events with them, I said, "Can we do an event with Matthew Cordell and talk about
Yeah.
his book that came out 2 years ago?"
Yeah. I was
Because I know
asking
that,
I was talking to my family. We were having dinner right before this, and I was like, was that 2 years ago? Because I mean, it was a little more than 2 years ago at this point, but
yeah,
yeah, it was. I can't believe that was 2 years ago when all this was happening. It's pretty wild.
it has been a very, very long haul.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I feel like we're in a much better place than we were 2 years ago, but in that respect, at least, things seem so uncertain and nobody knew how long things were going to be like that. And it was just kind of daunting. I mean, I feel like at least there's some normalcy to the way we go about our lives now, but back then it was pretty intimidating, when it was just
mm,
everything was locking down and oh, it was weird times. But yeah, I can't believe that's been 2 years. Yeah.
and I think I saw you post that. Was it just yesterday that you had your first in-person event since the?
Yeah, I've done so many Zooms and like even school visits that are through, you know, I forget what all the platforms are called, but I've done so many virtual things, and that yesterday I had my very first school visit at a town near where I live, Wilmette, Illinois, at a school there, and I got to speak, face to face with three different groups of kids and kindergarten, first and second, and then we did a little pen and ink and watercolor workshop in the art room. It was just really gratifying, it was like just soul filling to be able to be back in that space. And because I mean, I've been talking to kids through the screen for, as we said, 2 years now. So
Yeah.
it's just a strange way to connect. I mean, in one way, it's like it's strange and kind of cold, but in the other way, it's pretty amazing that we had that. If we didn't have that, it would have just been complete separation for years, which would have been, terrible for everyone, I think. But
Mhm.
it was just really nice to be able to be in person at something for the first time and get to see the audience that you're reading to, like, right there, and see how they react to things. So it was really sweet. It was really a great day.
That's really nice. At my kids' school, they had an art show, and there was the voting for the school board, and then there was a chorus concert all going on, and it was just very. It was nice, but it was just so like looking around. I guess this is normal. Like these are the things that we do now, right?
Yeah.
um, Still, just kind of like it feels more normal now, but it's still just that adjustment phase of
Right.
getting back to it. And having young kids, most a good chunk of my youngest entire life it has been a pandemic. So the
Right.
older two, it started when my son was in preschool and when my daughter was into kindergarten. So it's been a good chunk of their existence
Hmm.
going through history.
Yeah, really.
But on getting to the topic of your book, as soon as we logged on, we noticed that we have similar backgrounds. So
Yeah.
we both have that appreciation for Mr. Rogers. At the time that your book was coming out, and really, it seems like the last 4 years or so, Mr. Rogers has had this resurgence. He's having a moment,
Hmm.
a long one, where your book, the biography for adults, a movie, a documentary, and then I don't know how popular it was, but I enjoyed it. There's a podcast called Finding Fred um, that were
Hmm.
all coming out pretty close to the same time. How was it that you decided on Mr. Rogers as your next project?
Well, for me, I think what had happened in the last several years was that there was a really big anniversary. I guess it was the 50th anniversary of the first airing of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and which I think was 2018. So there was so much sort of excitement around that, and and I think there was, just because of the amount of darkness that sort of entered the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, everyone is experiencing it in different ways, but I feel like our country's gone through a lot of upheaval and political and social turmoil, and I think people are really hungry for just positive uh, voices, and I think all these memes were starting to surface, with Mr. Rogers quotes and things like that, and people were remembering the television program and remembering what a person he was. But for me, it started years before that, where, I mean, I grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I was born in 1975, so that was like still prime time for the program in those years. But I didn't really think much about Mr. Rogers until I became a dad myself. My daughter
Mm-hmm.
was born in 2008. And when she got about 2 years old and we were watching TV occasionally in the mornings, a little bit in the afternoons, we would always have sort of PBS on. This now television is even different now from then
Yeah.
to now. I mean, I think people don't always watch TV live anymore, but I had our one of our local PBS affiliates on, just sort of in the background. Even might have been playing in the other room, and I heard the opening song of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood come on, and it just kind of I just went into the room. Because it wasn't really on the air that often,
Mm-hmm.
even then, and we sat down and watched it together, and by the end of the program, I was just kind of a mess, like just kind of an emotional mess, just because I mean, there was this nostalgia that was kind of remembering my own childhood, but there were things I had not noticed about Mr. Rogers and about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood through the eyes of a parent, for the first time, and just the sincerity of it, and just the real emotion, the connection that he made through the television, speaking to children and families, and just the positive, it just felt so reassuring, and it wasn't, there's no irony or sarcasm or insincerity, and it was just so refreshing that I would watch it every day, even if my kids weren't around, I would just watch it. It was just such a, being a person who makes things for kids, I, I just hadn't really experienced something like that in a long time. I feel like there's sort of an edge to a lot of things, whether it be a humorous edge, or like sort of a ironic twist, and it was so just real and kind, and it wasn't, there was no tricks, it wasn't like there was like a gag behind it or something. It was just so pure, and it just moved me so much that I just kept watching it, and then eventually it dawned on me that this was at a time when people weren't talking about Mr. Rogers too. So I was like, I'd never done any nonfiction at that time. I'd never written any for sure, but I'd never illustrated any as well. So, but I was like thinking how, how cool it would be to make a picture book biography about Mr. Rogers, because he hadn't been in the spotlight for a while, and he was really just this singular person, like, and the character in the television program for sure, but and I didn't really know anything about the real real Fred Rogers.
Yeah.
So I started to read about him and just like watch interviews, and it quickly occurred to me that Fred Rogers was Mr. Rogers. There was no, he wasn't playing a character, he was completely that person, which kind of blowed me away even more, because this is like a real person who was this kind and genuine, and just loved children so much and devoted his life to wanting to help them navigate the world, and the good and the bad. There were just as many dark things to navigate in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He didn't shy away from those things. So after kind of discovering all that, I knew like I needed to try to get this done, but I knew it was going to be an undertaking for me, because like I said, I'd never done anything like that before. So it was quite a project to look down the road at. It took me a while to even just get started.
What was the beginning stages of the research? And one thing I'm curious, because there were a couple of Mr. Rogers books, children's books, that came out close, like shortly thereafter.
Right.
But yours is the official
Yeah.
Fred Rogers book. So, what was
Hmm.
the research project like, and how did you win over the Fred Rogers Foundation to get their approval on that?
Well, when I originally was thinking about the idea, it took me, I would say, years just to kind of get out of my own head, and stop. I wouldn't call it even procrastination. It was just, I was just intimidated by it, like, because I'd never tried to write a biography of any kind, professionally anyway, and I'd never tried to do that kind of research. I mean, I had done a little bit. I had done some research for my book Wolf in the Snow, because that was based on. Uh, it was based on the actual behaviors of wolves. So I had contacted some different wildlife biologists, but to write a biography about a beloved, iconic figure of American pop culture and television, I knew that there was going to be a lot of uh, hurdles to cross to do something like that. It wouldn't just be research. I would have to find the right people who could tell me it was, I would have that permission to do it, and I could show the characters and use the character names and song lyrics and all that stuff. And I just kept thinking it was just so daunting that I would just kind of, and I was working on a lot of other projects along the way. So it took me a while to just say, I really want to do this. So I got to carve out the time and figure out who I need to talk to. And along that road, my family, we all go to these sort of comic book and pop culture conventions. That's kind of one of our things that we like to do together.
Yeah.
And we saw that David Newell, the man who plays Mr. McFeely, who played Mr. McFeely on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, was going to be appearing at a comic book convention, with a couple other sort of classic PBS actors. And so we were thinking, oh, we should go see him, and maybe I could talk to him about making this book. And So we went to see him, and he was just as wonderful as you would hope that he would be.
Mm.
But I just never, I didn't get up the courage to say anything. And then I'd say probably another year passed, and I was talking to an author friend of mine who lives in Pittsburgh, Jonathan Oxier, and he told me that he had a friend of a friend who worked for Fred Rogers Productions, and he said that I should get in touch with that person. And so I found out that person was David Newell. So I was like, I got to do this. There's too many signs pointing to that I really should just just get out of my chair and do it. And so I emailed him, and then we had a nice long conversation, and then he sort of gave me an email of someone, because he's sort of semi-retired. He's just sort of, I think he might be on sort of the board in some way, but he's mostly retired. So he gave me a couple different names of people to contact at Fred Rogers Productions. At the time, I think it was called Family Communication. So there's been all these different changes, but there was some convincing to do, because just sending someone an email and say I'm an author and an illustrator and I want to do this, and they don't work in the same circle that I do. They're television, so they don't. Anybody can say I'm an author and an illustrator, and so it was a little, understandably so. There was some, I wouldn't say skepticism, but just sort of like, they're busy, and they weren't really, they have their own projects to deal with. And I just don't know I don't know how seriously they thought I was or could be. So there was kind of a lot of, I wouldn't say, there was just sort of a lot of time between emails. I felt like there was some hesitation. And then around that time was when my book Wolf in the Snow won the Caldecott Medal. So my editor, who I was trying to get Hello Neighbor published with, said, why don't you send them a copy of Wolf in the Snow that has the Caldecott sticker on it? So I sent that, and then it sort of, I think it clicked to them that I was a serious person, and I really wanted to do this book justice. It wasn't like, we finally got a time to talk on the phone, and they could see how sincere I was and how much love I had for Mr. Rogers. And at that point, things really started to move along, thankfully. And so, yeah, it was a long journey, but it was just really validating, to be able to do it. And then, had already written a manuscript at that point, but I hadn't actually talked to a lot of the people that I didn't have that sort of access until I got that kind of thumbs up from Fred Rogers Productions, where I could actually talk to the people that worked directly with him in Pittsburgh, and I could go to his hometown of Latrobe and go to the Fred Rogers Center and have access to all of these photographic archives. And so it really was invaluable. And I didn't want to make a book that didn't have the clearance to talk about all the things that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to have the character names. I wanted to use song lyrics. I wanted to have just full reign of all the visual iconography that went with Mr. Rogers. Otherwise, it wasn't going to be as meaningful to me. And I just didn't want to do it without the blessing of the people that knew and loved him and are still associated with his legacy. So yeah, it was so exciting though, once I got that, once that sort of green light came on, and I was able to really know for at last that it was really going to happen.
That's quite the journey. I didn't expect it to be.
I know,
uh,
it was a long stretch.
in terms of just the decisions made while you're creating the book, I was curious because there's so many Fred Rogers quotes So I was
Hmm.
curious how you determined. I'll just read the quote that you kicked the book off with: "Of it's our insides that make us who we are, that allow us to dream and wonder and feel for others. That's what's essential. That's what will always make the biggest difference in our world." What level of stress did you have for choosing the right quote um,
For the
to kick the
beginning,
book off? Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I knew that I didn't want it to be a quote that has been
memed.
circulated, like, yeah,
Yeah.
so many times, because he's so much more than a meme, I mean, if
Mhm.
you just Google his quotes, the things he said were so profound, and there's endless sound bites and endless insightful quotes. And I knew that I wanted it to be a lesser known quote, but also one that spoke about the interior of a person, because that was something, an interior of a person and the singularity of a person, because that was really something that he just spoke about so often. Was I mean, he ended every show talking about how singular and special each and every person is, and that's how we can contribute to the world at large and make the world better, is by knowing that and by sharing that, and for him, one of the things that made him an individual was his musical abilities. I mean, that was like, it just permeated everything that he did. So I knew I wanted to open it up with a quote that kind of touched on that, but also open it up with him playing music in some way.
Mhm.
And his music was his expression. He spoke about that many times, about how he didn't always know how to express his feelings. So he would sometimes bang on the piano and work out sort of his bad feelings just by playing music, and how, lightly or aggressively he would hit the keys. And that was just one of his forms of expression, but I wanted to have in the picture all of the things that he did throughout his life that were impactful to others, sort of coming out of the piano. And the music being, I feel like, the main sort of channel that he used. But he was so creative and so expressive in so many other ways, that I wanted to have a lot of those visual symbols of characters and important, stories from his life. And there's all kinds of little Easter eggs throughout the whole book, for and it's fun, because I don't expect everyone to know what all that means. And I did try to put a little glossary. I think it's called a visual glossary at the end of the book, where it kind
Yes.
of explains a lot of some of those smaller little drawings might mean. And because it's just story after story of just incredible moments from his life, and stories from his life. And
I was
I mean,
curious um, with the visual gallery, what the decision was behind that, and it kind of struck me as something Fred would appreciate. That
hmm,
the ways in which he described things to people and wanted to children, but wanted things to be very clear and to have
right,
this book. And then at the end of it, like, oh, this is what this picture meant. This is what this picture meant.
yeah.
Was that part of your thought process?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, I think I knew that I wanted there to be what we call in the publishing business, we call, there's a number of pages that you can include in a nonfiction picture book. Could be several spreads or whatever at the end, that we call back matter. Um, and it's usually like, it might have like a timeline, for a historical timeline about something. It could be a more in-depth essay, of things that you wanted to include in the main part of the text, but you can't include everything. So,
Mhm.
because it is for a young reader. Um, and it could be, photographs. I mean, I knew that I wanted to jam as much stuff in there as I could, because making a picture book, you're limited to, probably I could have made like an 80-page picture book about
Yeah.
Mr. Rogers, but uh, ultimately you have to consider your audience. So I tried to just jam as much as I could in the back in hopes that and try to make it visually appealing too. And I remember I had the essay in there. I had the idea that there were going to be some photographs once we figured out what those were. I wanted to write also a piece about how Mr. Rogers, what he meant to me as personally. But then I believe it was my art director who said, as I was explaining the sketches, when I first sent the sketches to the publisher, I was saying, well, this thing, I want to open it up with a traffic light because that's how every episode opened on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And I was sort of explaining all these things. And they're things that like you don't really necessarily need to know in order to read the book.
Yeah.
But my editor and my art director were like, we should have something that explains all of the significance of some of these things because they're all interesting stories, I mean, he didn't have just a flashing yellow light randomly at the beginning of every show. It was sort of a symbol that people needed to slow down, and take in what was about the story that he was going to tell, or the messages of each program. So there was a sort of a meaning to all of these things, and it could have just been like little like in sort of insider little illustrations for the super hardcore
Yeah.
Mr. Rogers fans, but I think it was a great idea that we should try to explain some of these. So because I think they're, for people who don't know what that is, it's just another way to learn about all these wonderful stories, throughout the book.
As a Mr. Rogers super fan myself, there
Hmm.
was one aspect the visual gallery did teach me, or heard a story that I hadn't heard before about his car being stolen
Yeah.
um, while they were filming, and that the word was spread that Mr. Rogers' car was stolen, and then it was just returned with a note of, if I had known it was yours, I never would have taken it. That
Yeah.
just to show and we're where our store is, we're about 2.5 hours from Pittsburgh, and it's very much a vacation town. So we have a lot of Pittsburgh people that come through, and we're also very close to the Chautauqua Institution. And Mr. Rogers used to
Mm-hmm.
always he would visit there frequently. So there's
Mm-hmm.
just everybody knows in the community that knows me knows of my appreciation for Mr. Rogers. So I've been able to just kind of hear all of their little anecdotes of the different times that they've met him, and every story is very similar because he had that same, just he was just a consistently very intentional person in the things that he
Right.
did.
Yeah, that story about the car, I don't remember where I was when I first heard that or the circumstances, but I can't really retell that story without getting choked up just because it's really difficult to think of someone past or present who would have that effect
Yeah.
on sort of the darkest element of society, like that. I mean, not to say that I don't know the story of the thieves. I don't know why they did it, but for someone to steal a car, I think for whatever reason, it has to be a pretty dark reason. And for them to turn around and say, uh, I'm sorry, and give it back,
Yeah.
and write a note like that. And that was a thing that I wasn't sure was like an urban legend too, because I couldn't really find it verified anywhere. It wasn't in any, I don't think, any interviews that he gave. So I asked David Newell if he had any recollection, and he did, but he didn't totally remember what the car was because I wanted to figure out sort of what kind of car it was so I could draw it in the book. And so he
Hmm.
ended up asking Joanne Rogers, and I got more information and confirmation on it just because I wanted it to be in the book, but I wanted to make sure that it was true because it's one of those things. I mean, there's a lot of stories I feel like that people tell about Mr. Rogers that are just, it's hard to believe that a person like this existed, you know, and that he had this effect on people. But most of the time you find out it's true, you know, and it's so moving. And you know, if there was, when people always ask that sort of question, like if you could meet any person living or not living, who would that be? And most of the time I'm not really interested in meeting artistic heroes or historical figures, because I'm always afraid they're going to be disappointing. You know, I'm always afraid they're going to be, it's going to shatter my gleaming expectations of that person. But I just really wish I could have met him. You know, I think there was, I just don't feel like I could, there's no way I would have ever felt bad coming away from that. You know, I would have only felt better. And so that's sort of the response I ever give to that question is, hands down, it would be Fred Rogers, just to be able to talk to him and just really just get a vibe for, like, you know, just to see what I don't know. It's just so, it just amazes me, you know, that someone so kind and compassionate, even in the face of terrible things, you know, like he was still there and he was still able to help people. And it just amazes me, you know.
Um, there, you had touched on it briefly a little bit about just kind of the publication process, but I was curious to see, because you have acted as kind of just an illustrator for books, what was kind of the difference between being all in, doing every aspect of writing and drawing, in comparison to when you're illustrating a book?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've always been a visual artist, you know, as long as I can remember. You know, I've always liked to draw. And I went to school for art. You know, I was a graphic designer for years, and I worked, you know, as a fine artist, and then ended up becoming children's illustrator because my wife was a writer and a children's elementary librarian, school librarian. And so I didn't go into books and publishing thinking I would be a writer. You know, I had already sort of naturally was drawing anyway. So it was sort of a natural, you know, transition to do illustration
Mhm.
in children's books. But I didn't really think, at least not right away, that I would be able to write stories, you know. And I did try, but they were just terrible, you know, because I had no grasp of what it took to write for children. I, I didn't have children, and we didn't have children in those early days. I didn't have friends that had children in those days, so I hadn't been around children for many years. So um, I think it was easier for me to illustrate for children because I knew that language. You know, at least I knew the visual language of how to communicate in that way. But so eventually I started doing more school visits just as an illustrator, you know, and I started to, and then, you know, started to be around kids as, as other friends had kids. And then fortunately my wife and I started to have kids, and it just really opened my brain up to how to communicate in that way with words, you know, and what kids are capable of understanding and not capable of understanding. Uh, and also just what, you know, I was reading more too. I was reading more and more picture books, and I think that's really key in order to writing a book, a picture book, is you have to read as much of it as you can, you know. And early in the early days, I always had really just been reintroduced to children's books by Julie, my wife. So I just kind of was going in blind, you know.
Mhm.
And so I started to, I started to get a better grip year by year, and I would try to share my stories with editors that I worked with as an illustrator, and there would be a lot of sort of like, polite dismissal. But eventually, I wrote a good enough sort of beginning of a story that my editor, Liz Sabla at Macmillan, was willing to work with me and kind of figure out how to make it into a workable manuscript. And so it was just little baby steps, one thing after the next. And now I still feel like an illustrator who gets to write sometimes, but
Okay.
I feel like less so of that, because I feel more and more confident as a writer all the time. So, at this point, I don't know the number of books, but I've written and illustrated quite a few picture books, fiction. I've illustrated, I've illustrated, Hello Neighbor was my first nonfiction, but I illustrated another nonfiction picture book last year, I think, came out, and I'm writing a beginning reader chapter books now too. So I just feel more sort of empowered, I don't know, with every year, and I feel like I actually enjoy it. I don't feel as sort of overwhelmed when I had to think like, oh, I have to think of an idea to write a
Mhm.
book. I really feel like the ideas are really there, like I just have to I just have to realize them. So yeah, I feel
And
sort of, I don't say like equal author and illustrator. There's still a little more illustrator than author, but I enjoy them both, and I feel good about doing them both. So
I had a question down, but you kind of answered it. It's more so for the benefit of just one of my customers. Their son, we just brought in his first. I think it's his first book that he wrote and illustrated. But he's still very much in the early stages of his career, where he's illustrated a couple of books. Some things have not gone very well in terms of contract negotiations and things. But if you had if you had one piece of advice to offer to somebody who is trying to get started as an illustrator, can you think of some something that you wish
um,
you knew going in?
yeah, I think the I think humility is best in many walks of life. I think going in not expecting your first book to sell 1 million copies, and not
Mhm.
expecting everyone to just want to drop everything and promote your book. I'm not saying that this person did that,
Yeah.
but I think just being realistic about expectations and knowing that careers need to sort of grow. I would say it's really uncommon for like a first book to just be this sort of groundbreaking hit. um, I think it's more likely that it's kind of a slow and steady growth, because you're still learning too. You're still learning how to make a good book. I feel like your first book is not your best work. It's your first work. So, and just knowing that things are going to be small in the beginning. I feel like I didn't always know that either. I didn't always. I just thought, oh, like and getting a book published, this is it, like life has changed for good now. But it's still, there's still a lot of time and growth that needs to happen. And it's a very, it's a business that requires a lot of patience and dedication. Uh, if you want to keep doing it, it takes a lot of self-motivation. It takes a lot of patience. And I think the best thing though is just not to expect the moon, in the early days, and you won't be as disappointed. It's I think people don't want to tell you that because they don't want to, crush any hopes, but it's sort of it takes sort of some figuring out to realize that you're not being deprived of, when you're not getting the promotion that you want, when you're not getting the the exposure that you want. It's not that it's a pretty normal situation to be in. You know, it's like, and we only see the books that are like have full page ads in the New York Times or whatever. We don't see the many books that don't have that. So it's I think it's just really just be glad that you're getting a book published, and kind of keep your expectations realistic, and it'll keep you going for a long time. You know, if you get burned out and jaded early on, it's kind of it's not gonna take you very far, you know.
There, we frequently have a lot of aspiring or early authors that watch these events, and what you had said about you got your first publishing deal, and you could have the thought of, oh, well, this is it. One of our best-selling authors in the store, who's local to the Buffalo area, she had a 3-book deal for a mystery series, and it's just kind of like, oh, that's the dream. I've got a multi-book deal. And then as her deal was getting close to expiring, the parent company ended up dissolving the publisher that she was working for. So then she ended up having to start from scratch and
Oh
starting
wow,
all over again. So
it's tough.
it definitely is a long haul.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and you have, didn't want to forget to mention it, but you have a book coming out soon. Would you like to talk about that project?
Which one is that?
Is it now I'm
Is it one
blanking
of
on
the
the
cornbread
is
and
it
poppy ones?
yes. Is
Okay,
it
yeah.
June, July
Um,
when the
yeah, I have a couple books coming out in June actually. The one that so I mentioned that I've just started writing beginning reader, early reader chapter book series. The the series I guess is called Cornbread and Poppy. The first book came out, I believe it was in January of this year, and the second one, the first one's just called Cornbread and Poppy. It's a sort of a fun friendship adventure stories about these two mice named Cornbread and Poppy, and so the first one is just sort of a getting to know them sort of story, but it's also it's a story that sort of showcases their different personalities. Cornbread is kind of a very he's a very hardworking, more serious mouse. He's very dedicated and big into planning and making sure everything is right. And Poppy is more sort of a free spirit adventurer. And so they're always trying to kind of like, you know, imbibe their different personality traits onto each other. And so it's a fun sort of dynamic to bring together for all the different books. But so the first one is about sort of that, you know, and it's an adventure a wintry adventure they have. And then the second book that comes out in June is called Cornbread and Poppy at the Carnival, which is a more summer, spring carnival, you know, fun book like that. Also, that sort of touches on how they are different, but how they are the same, and how much they like each other and appreciate each other's differences. So and I'm working on the third one currently now, so there will be 3 and 4 at least. So it's
nice.
exciting.
Well, I
I
will go
just
back and order book one, and then get my orders
yeah,
in for book
thanks.
two.
Yeah, I had a long run of feel like of books that were uh, more serious in nature. I mean, I had a
Bear
book about
Island is a rough one.
yeah, Bear Island.
I
It
always have
touches
to give the
on
trigger warning when somebody looks at it. I'm like, this is a great book, but
yeah,
just be aware that you may be consoling your child
right.
at the end of it.
Yeah. I mean, I had like Wolf in the Snow is a very serious book, and I feel like, and I did another wordless book called Explorers, which sort of touches on prejudices, and um, Bear Island, which talks about loss, and even, you know, Hello Neighbor is a light-hearted book, but it has elements of seriousness, you know, just like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood did. And so I've gotten into this vibe where I just want to tell fun adventure stories for a while, and animal characters, and I mean, uh, they can still have sort of twists and things, and unexpected things happen, which I think is important to try to weave into every book, so that you don't know how it's going to end on the final page. You don't see things coming, but at the same time, I needed as a creator, I feel like I needed a break from the seriousness of the world, because I get all of that. I get a lot of it from, the news feeds, and
Mhm.
and just watching books that other people are making. I think we're all just reacting to what's happening in the world, and um, I I don't always want to I don't always want to live in that, even as a creator. I feel like sometimes I want to escape too. So the last several projects I feel like I've done have been more about escaping the hardships of the world, and I'll probably want to come back to that at some point, but Cornbread and Poppy is definitely a diversion from that.
As a bookseller, I'm going through a similar shifts where you just want to be able to have the tough stories and be able to have people exposed to those. And then I was looking at our selection of storybooks, and I'm just like, this is depressing. Like if somebody
Yeah.
just wanted to pick up a good book, like I've got a good selection of like Mo Willems and similar along that line, but there's a whole chunk of books where I'm just like, so I made a point when I was doing my orders for this week that there's a new children's book called, it's like about a unicorn named Donut that wanted to learn how to fly, and I'm like,
Hmm.
perfect.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah. I
what we
mean,
need, right?
I think I think, it's like I said, I think there's been a lot of reaction in as creators, because a lot of us, I think, are naturally empathetic, when you make things, and when you're constantly trying to get perspectives from other people that aren't like you. So when you see the difficulties that are happening around the world, and in our own country especially, you you feel like you want to address that, and so that I feel like there's been years of of reaction to that, and including my own output. I don't know how other creators are feeling, but I feel like I want to I need a break from that, and
Yeah.
I would imagine that the young readers that we're making things for would like a break from it at times, at least, as well. So, I think now's a good time to mix it up,
Yeah.
and not make just, dark picture books, or just something that
A
is,
break.
yeah, a break is something that's more fun, I think, to read. It's not really, you're not trying to learn a lesson. It's just an adventure.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So we're coming up on our hour. Something that I always like to put in at the end, because I like to get recommendations. Um, if you can recommend any, it doesn't have to be children's, but if it's children's, great. Any authors that you've enjoyed, or if there's anything that you're reading now or have read recently that you've been excited about that you'd like to share.
That's a good question. Trying to remember. Whenever I'm asked that, my mind just goes straight to
Same. I don't know
blank.
why I
I
subject this
know,
to
I'm like,
people, but
yeah, I'm reading constantly, but the thing that I've been reading lately is I've been reading a lot of um, David Bowie biographies, because I'm writing a David Bowie picture book biography.
nice.
Um, So there's quite a few. I mean, there's quite a few great. All of them are unofficial because he never actually did an official autobiography or even an official biography before he died. But there was one that I just found. There's one that's like a graphic novel, and I can't remember the titles, which is terrible. But I'm trying to look around. I think they're at my house, but there's one that's a really good graphic novel, uh, and it's a sort of, it blends fact and fiction. So which is sort of like his whole thing. I don't know if you know David Bowie, but he
Hmm.
never really he never really revealed himself. There was all these different sort of personalities and musical personalities, and people always wondered what the real David Bowie was like. So there's this graphic novel that I just finished that's sort of a blend of like science fiction, fantasy David Bowie with a lot of the true stories. And then there was this is terrible because I can't remember the titles.
That's
There's
the
another.
struggle of somebody who's always around books, is not being able to remember the name of the author or the title of anything.
Right. There's another David Bowie book it's just stories from, some of it's from interviews that he did, but a lot of it is just from people that knew him. And so it's all these like really fascinating stories about uh, his life and different parts of his career. And so it's just really, it was really cool to read because, like I said, there's not really a book that he ever approved anyway you just don't really get a sense for who the real person was. So
Mm,
yeah. But
I see.
in terms of picture books, i I have one on my shelf that I let me just grab it.
Sure.
So I know I just finished talking about how I needed a break from serious picture books, but this one's
Yeah.
pretty heady. It's pretty serious. It's about the end of a dog's life. The Longest Let's Go Boy by Derek Wilder and one of my very favorite illustrators, Katya Chin. And it's beautifully illustrated and it's beautifully told. It's told through the voice of the dogs, and it's really unique. It's really unique sort of cadence and pronunciation of words, and so it's pretty lighthearted in a way, but it's also kind of
A dead dog.
yeah. So, but it's a beautiful book.
Well, despite what I said, I'll probably end up bringing that one in too. So we'll have to
Yeah, I
bring
mean, I
it in.
definitely recommend it. It's really sweet, but yeah, I wish I could remember those David Bowie titles. It's like I can never remember song titles, and I can remember the names of the subject, obviously, but I can
Well,
remember
you can
band names
message me
pretty
if
good.
you remember, and I'll
Yeah,
gather
yeah,
it
I'll do that after.
up.
Yeah, yeah.
And I know that you have to pick up your daughter. I just saw a message come across my screen that my toddler is being a terror for bedtime,
Oh
so we
no.
both should leave. But I do want to plug. There's your book. Obviously, we have. I know we have Hello Neighbor, obviously, and we have Bear Island. I feel like we have a couple others of yours that I am escape. The name is escaping me, and we will definitely be bringing in the Cornbread and Poppy books, so we can all have a nice escape. So you can look for those if you're in our area. If you're not in our area, you can go to goodneighborbooks.com and connect with our bookshop page to order those through us. We have two events coming up in June that I want to make you aware of. How Free Speech Save Democracy is going to be on June 1st. Christopher Finan is a First Amendment expert and a very large advocate for full First Amendment. It's going to be an interesting conversation. He has done a lot of work within the book selling community, First Amendment issues, not even just the things that are in the news, but just the way we curate our bookstores, the difference between curation and censorship has become a hot topic in book selling. So I am looking forward to that talk. And then June 29th is I Can Take It From Here by Lisa Forbes. Lisa is, I forgot the phrase that she likes to use, and I wish I could remember it because I would have used it. But she is an ex convict. She had murdered an abusive spouse. It's a very hard hitting topic, but she served her time. Coming out of prison, she obviously had a struggle finding a job. She saw that that was not an uncommon problem, so she started up her own company where she is connecting people who are now out of prison with companies that are willing to hire them. So it's her story about her struggle and the trauma that she went through and the work that she put into to overcome that. So two really great conversations coming up in June. That one's June 29th, both Wednesdays at 7. So look for those and add them to your calendar. Thank you again, Matthew, and thank you all for watching.
I was just looking up
Oh yeah.
some titles. I found one is called David Bowie, An Oral History.
Okay.
That's not the graphic novel, but I can't seem to find the. Oh, there it is. The other book is called Bowie, An Illustrated Life. Both of those are really, really. I recommend those for fans of David Bowie, especially. I would say because they really do him justice, I think.
That's great. I will look those up and add them to our music section.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you again. It was great chatting with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Bob.
Have a nice night.
You too.